Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam, hello, this is Adnan Hussein with a short note ahead of this upcoming episode. Just to let you know that we had a bit of a technical problem where the very last part of Dr. Ariel Salzmann's remarks in conversation with me were cut off. This is episode 8 coming up, the update for Palestine and the world, history in a time of genocide denial, covering December 2024 to the very beginning of August 2025. So that 8-month period, I had a conversation with Ariel to cover major developments that had taken place during that period in the genocide. But don't fear, the rest of the episode is here, and I want to remind you that we will have a chance to fill in any gaps and cover any issues that we missed or were dropped off because of technical problems during the Q&A live stream in office hours with Professor Adnan Hussein. My special guest, of course, will be Dr. Ariel Salzmann, so that we can talk about any questions that you have for the entire series, as well as what's been happening currently, and where we need to go in terms of our activism and action. So join me and Dr. Salzmann Friday, August 8th, 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time, okay, for another one of these office hour live streams where you can post your questions in the chat or on social media to me to put to Dr. Salzmann. Or, of course, if you're a patron, you can go on patreon.com/Adnan Hussein and post there in the chat that I've created a discussion forum so that people can post their comments and questions, and they will have priority. But we look forward to seeing all of you for the Q&A with Dr. Ariel Salzmann in this series, Palestine and the World, History in a Time of Genocide. I hope you find Part 8 update useful. Certainly is depressing, but I hope you find it useful. We'll see you on Friday. Salam, hello, peace to you all. Welcome, listeners, watchers on YouTube and listeners on audio podcast. I'm Adnan Hussein, a professor of medieval Mediterranean and Islamic world history at Queen's University. And I am back with my colleague and friend, Dr. Ariel Salzmann, for an update edition, part 8 of the series that I hope you've been watching, Palestine and the World, History in a Time of Genocide Denial. As you all know, the episode 7 was recorded and concluded in December 2024, so there's quite a lot to catch up on. But before going any further, let me welcome and reintroduce my colleague, Dr. Ariel Salzmann, who is an Ottoman and early modern Mediterranean and world historian at Queen's University. And this series was based on a course that she taught in fall 2024, a series of conversations and digests to make available to the wider public some of the reframing and analysis to bring some historical context to understand what was happening and how we got to where we were. And so, Ariel, it's wonderful to have you back again.
Thank you for having me back. And sadly, the situation is worse than ever before that we're addressing. So on the one hand, this history is ongoing, unfolding, and, we're watching a global scale of tragedy in the making as we record this.
Yes. We ended the last episode, which was titled Gaza is the World's Future, by looking prospectively at what some of the consequences would be. it's been 8 months since that time, and an awful lot has happened. And as you point out, we are now on the precipice of mass starvation, mass death scenario, not only due to direct violence in the genocide, but because of the cruel and, almost total siege upon Gaza. Um, when we recorded before, it was after the election. Trump won the U.S. election, but before Donald Trump took office, and there were some people who thought that perhaps there would be a change. Trump, as he is sort of clever at doing, harnesses critiques and discontent in an ambiguous way, and tries to give the impression that he will solve these problems. And so he made outreach to Muslim and Arab communities in the Midwest and battleground states like Michigan, and especially Michigan, to say that he would solve the problem. And, people were so disgusted with the Biden administration's complicity, more than complicity, their role in creating the genocide, that there were some hopes, perhaps vain as they may have appeared, that there would be a change and a shift in U.S. policy. Um, Tell us a little bit more about the future that we were kind of anticipating, and what started to happen, and what did we realize very quickly in the new year upon the inauguration of Donald Trump.
Well, as most of us suspected, the things were going to get worse because of Trump's overall fecklessness when it comes to foreign policy, and his, primary desire to line his own pockets in anything, in any way he does things, or to maintain himself in the media. This proximity that he already demonstrated with Netanyahu, was there for, his son-in-law's best friends with the Netanyahu family, had profited during the first Trump administration, through basically besieging Qatar in order to tap into their sovereign wealth funds and all these other things. So there was a healthy degree of skepticism that things would improve. On the other hand, even people in the region, so it's not just Michigan, sort of had this vain belief that this transactional president could rein in Netanyahu, give him something he wanted, bring the Gulf states, principally the Saudis, on board and make something happen. And, there was some evidence it could have. I mean, his envoy did take Netanyahu to task for a while. And it's hard to understand, except for the general lack of, seriousness of Trump himself, why this couldn't have gone further, had he wanted to. But he's a person who's, infinitely distracted, infinitely vain. And so the only way to explain his politics, I think, misses the boat, when you see it larger, imagining him as having anything larger, any kind of larger vision than personal aggrandizement in this process. There are those around him who, of course, want maximalist aims. And part of it had to do with, of course, Trump's primary interest, and that of his enablers like Elon Musk, was dismantling the U.S. state and the U.S. relationship in the world. So that actually took precedent, as he gave Netanyahu largely free rein in doing anything he wanted in Gaza. So it did, as we know, lead temporarily to a ceasefire and a sort of false hope. In the meantime, of course, Netanyahu just turned and basically did an about face and turned his guns on the rest of the region, moving into Syria, moving into Lebanon. And, again, there's this sort of dualism going on, a brinkmanship between Netanyahu and Trump as to who can go farther and who's going to put on a greater display of power and excess. And meanwhile, of course, Trump in no way stopped the guns from flowing, the bombs from flowing to Israel. And if anything, recoalesced the Republican, pro-Zionist Christian Zionist movement to support Israel at any cost, including installing a Christian Zionist as ambassador to Israel. So everything that was bad about the first Trump administration is now far worse and was far more unbridled, leading up to the point where these two uh, you know don't even want to call them leaders, these two heads of state are in effect goading each other on to take more and more drastic action. In the meantime, of course, there is reaction in the region. They are very, notable, brave attempts to defend the Palestinians in Yemen by the Houthis. And in various other parts throughout the world, the demonstrations continue backing Gaza and Palestine. So, but the siege continues. By March, of course, the siege ended. The very short ceasefire ended, as did whatever supplies were allowed into the region, and this includes medicine, water, shelter, food, baby formula, fuel to run the hospitals, and the whole thing by March. So we have this very short window, and by March, the siege has become even worse, with not any aid coming in to the region, and the world's population's rising up. I mean, in the first year alone, I saw a metric. It was 32,000 demonstrations worldwide. The majority being between North Africa and Pakistan, North Africa and Turkey, and on the other side in North America. So you have worldwide protest and the absolute lack of any response, primarily by the West. The International Court of Justice had already long ago made a ruling that remained unenforced. And that ruling wasn't even to hold Israel at that point accountable for genocide, but to prevent it, to allow the necessary supplies to enter the region to prevent genocide. And there was absolutely no enforcement by the U.S., by Israel and its allies. And if anything could make the situation worse, of course, was the back and forth between Iran and Israel. And perhaps you want to talk more about that and how that was purposely designed by the Israelis to shift the conversation away from Gaza.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do think that it has played that kind of a role. We've seen it over the course of the genocide that at points where some kind of political pressure publicly in the West in particular was being brought to bear, where there might be some muted criticisms rather than just cheering Israel on for its right to self-defense and so on. When there have been moments like when the ICJ made its first decisions that it would have to investigate, and that there was some possibility that there was a case to be made about genocide. At other moments where there has been diplomatic kind of cracks or openings that have appeared, we found that Israel has responded. The government has responded by widening the war to other theaters, and often using a ceasefire moment to attack elsewhere. And that usually these ceasefires are a combination of the resistance, stretching the limits of Israeli military capability, while at the same time some public political pressure perhaps being brought to bear. So there might be some political pressure to create and military pressure to have a ceasefire, but then immediately pivoting elsewhere. To widen the war into other and expand it into other theaters to achieve, goals regionally speaking. And I think it's clear that the boycott, the siege upon Gaza was reaching such a level, there started to be, Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada, Macron, President of France, and even Keir Starmer, who's been awful throughout from the very beginning of the genocide, and even despite the fact that he claims to have been and was a human rights lawyer, said that it was legal, for Israel to defend itself by imposing an interdict upon, food aid, water, electricity, all those things. He said at the very outset, he changed his tune and was also party to a letter that announced that there needed to be some kind of aid, to Gaza. There was a need for a ceasefire and so on. So there was some modicum of political pressure starting to mobilize and reach a crescendo upon Israel. And immediately thereafter, you have the IAEA issuing essentially a warrant for an attack on Iran by declaring on no clear basis whatsoever that they were in violation of the terms of the Proliferation Treaty, or that they were somehow violating agreements and so forth. And immediately thereafter, Israel's attack on Iran changed the whole tenor of how the situation was being discussed, because there was a state-to-state kind of conflict where Iran could be demonized as a rogue actor, a rogue state, and so on. And it just shifted the conversation and shifted the political attention that was building around some kind of pressure. And now once that so-called 12-day war has ended and a ceasefire has held since then, there has been again the building of pressure as more and more people see the images of babies and children starving and dying from horrific images that have been circulated. Again, now there is a kind of clarion call, almost as if all of these Western leaders received the same memo. Ursula von der Leyen, the Katja Kala, the Greek, foreign minister for the EU, and other leaders of, Western governments have made some tepid statements that acknowledge and recognize that the situation is reaching such levels of humanitarian collapse that they need to at least, they haven't committed to really doing anything, but they need to distance themselves somewhat. And I think all that they're doing is really trying to immunize themselves by confusing people about their previous policies and using words rather than any actual policy changes and actions to sanction Israel or stop the arms flow to protect themselves from future accountability, I think. I mean, there's both a contemporary political purpose, to relieve some pressure and say, yes, we are, responding, we're talking. But I think it's also really for history, which is important for us. Maybe later in the conversation, we'll talk a little bit about what are the possibilities for organizing, for action, for resistance, for
future accountability.
For future accountability. We can talk a little bit
but
more
I
about
think
that. But I think they're already
yeah.
positioning themselves to put, say, well, I was against it, in this way, and yes, it's gone too far, and so on. But it's not really a meaningful political step. It is, however, an index of the fact that the situation is so atrocious and that there is continuing political pressure building.
Okay, but I think that what was also very significant about the Iranian, first of all, Israel launching the attack on Iran, deliberately undermining, basically challenging Trump to do more. And I think that was highly significant. And of course, reconfigured the coalition behind Trump. Because at that point, I mean, I don't think we can separate these things out. He had dismantled, he's already, very successful in dismantling the U.S. state, as institutions, all of its foreign affairs, foreign aid, domestic institutions, vacuuming up the personal data of 300 million plus Americans, turning it over to Silicon Valley tech billionaires. So that's happening simultaneously, all of this. And he's got his, as neocon, Project 2025 people all on board. And then basically, in many ways, Netanyahu pushed him into the Iran situation, right? Sort of goaded him into that. which I think will have a long-term effect because it has completely changed his coalition. He's lost or diminished part of his support among his MAGA base, who are isolationists and who did not want to see that and who criticized him. At the same time, he's now been embraced by the neocons. So there is a decisive realignment, in the way that these various right-wing groups prioritize what they want from Trump. And it made it possible for Israel to continue doing what it's doing, expanding in the region, pretending as if, and it is in many respects, it's not a pretense, that it's acting for the West. It is the West's bastion in the Middle East, in the untamed Middle Islamic world. And this is the garrison that's protecting Europe. And so with that garrison, if we're going to invade Iran, we got to come on board. And the price is 2.1 million human beings in Gaza, and plus the millions outside in the West Bank, etc. So there's almost see what happened after Iran was a shift in the sort of quid pro quo about what's happening with this genocide.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's not incompatible analysis with also seeing the way, politically it may have been an opportune moment. There are too many larger geopolitical and strategic kinds of components and dimensions for it to have been simply that they wanted to change the conversation, of course. But I do think that it is possible also to estimate, the role of the Iran attack, that I agree with you completely would not have been a, kind of policy choice, of the Trump administration on reshaping his coalition, as it were, because, in point of fact, that coalition has been loyal despite previous examples in the first Trump administration of populating his entire administration with neocons like, Mike Pompeo, like,
but that was the
Bolton,
previous.
so
But
there
Bolton,
already
they're
have
all
been,
back on board. I mean,
there have already been a history of him being a kind of tool of neocon manipulation. However, what had to happen, the way in which it did exercise some constraint, is that you didn't want to have an open, interminable war like what's been happening in Gaza for 2 years. They could not, of course, sustain. So this is why they went for a kind of lightning attack that was a sort of regime change attack, because Israel and the United States would not have been, interested in a long war. So they took a kind of gamble. But I think Trump was very concerned, and the U.S. administration was very concerned not to let this, escalate wildly into a wider long-term sort of war. So that's where I think it may have had a political effect. I don't think that he lost a lot of political support domestically in his coalition. I think what has been more devastating for the MAGA, kind of loyalty with Trump has been the Jeffrey Epstein, revelations. That's been much more significant as a kind of culture, issue, culture war problem that has directed the populist anger towards corporate and political elites of society in ways that are like lots of right-wing populism that can get distracted over these kinds of issues rather than seeing the structural problem.
Well, again,
so,
we can
been,
discuss. I agree that whether it's much more, but I think there's a form. I think there was a formal shift. It was also an attitudinal shift in Europe. I think that silenced a lot of the critique of Netanyahu through that diversion into Iran. I think the Iranians knew, they were well aware of what was going to happen. They, of course, they bombed the day they were supposed to meet for future negotiations. I mean, so they did that. So they had negotiations scheduled, and then the U.S. sent the bombs. But they were pretty much aware that something like this was going to happen. So there was some kind of understanding there, both within his backers, that this wasn't going to lead to a long-term military engagement in Iran. But at the same time, it was also a signal to other groups of people that had stood somewhat on the sidelines, who had been somewhat sidelined, and now are really brought in fully into this. I mean, I think there's other things that are going on there, but I don't think, personally, I don't think he cares that much about his voting base. I mean, he's scared.
Obviously.
Yeah, because there's not going to be free elections. He doesn't anticipate that people are going to be able to vote freely and get to polling stations and not have non-gerrymandered, maps of voting. I mean, this is all what's anticipated. But on the other hand,
Regardless of that, Ariel, I mean,
yeah,
there's no, where structurally in American politics do you see U.S. politicians across the board, whether far right Republicans, centrist Republicans, centrist corporate Democrats, liberal Democrats, being very attuned to and responsive to their political base of
well,
voters?
I
This
think
is
this time
not
it
the,
goes. I think
this
this
is
time
not
it
the
goes
stage.
beyond
This is
that.
not the stage in
Yeah,
U.S. politics where there is something that we would call a democracy, really structurally for quite a long period of
but
time.
I
There
think
are
there's
local,
a difference between that and actually uh, putting your 17 million of your constituents on a death march because of lack of health insurance. I
yeah,
think
but
what's
that's
happening.
again a very different issue, and that's a domestic kind of
No,
question
but
that isn't related, I think, to the Iran war. I think that one thing that it's very possible, but we should never
yeah.
underestimate the importance and significance of Islamophobia in galvanizing and kind of disciplining, you might say, right-wing populist forces, whether in Europe or the United States. And so there might be some people who would be against, an attack on Iran, but what do they care really, as long as it doesn't turn into a long, war that's very costly. And where there's U.S. troops that have to be in the line of fire. As long as that's not going to
But
happen, I don't think you
I
could
do think
say that
it's
the Iran
silence.
war reshaped,
Well, it
part of
does.
his base,
Well, I stand by that. I do think there is a reshaping, and I also think it not only silenced the conversation in Europe about Gaza, you know, it basically put them on the line, because there was this presumption of an U.S. nuclear umbrella, right? Which is now being, France and Britain are now in negotiations. They're changing that whole configuration. Of course, it's opened the Pandora's box on nuclear proliferation, because you cannot be a state anywhere in the world without a bomb.
of
So
course. Yeah,
this has been a major, major shift, and has changed, global perspectives on,
absolutely.
and relativized, and this is relativized what's going on in Gaza as being the lesser
Absolutely.
of evils, right?
Yeah,
For
absolutely.
these Western powers and Western elites, and also, of course, reminded, brutal reminder, who's got the most military equipment in the world these days, at least for the foreseeable future, in terms of nuclear weapons, but in conventional weapons, cutting edge technology, etc. All of this was like a massive display of this overwhelming, whether it morphed into something larger. It's like, who's in control here, right? Who's got the weapons? Who's got their finger on who's got the nuclear codes for the destruction of the world many times over? Now, of course, this is all happening in the midst of Trump's failure to accomplish anything diplomatically, anything in terms of economic trade deals, or, all these many provinces that he's made his constituents, and, and the rest of the world. So that's happening. But in the meantime, it did something to, it further polarized elite politicians from the masses of people all over the world who are protesting for basic human rights, for basic human dignity, for the survival of a population that's being annihilated by a combination of a conspiracy of militarism and protecting of the perpetrators on the other hand, and silence on the other, and failure to take any kind of verbal, physical, military action to prevent what's going on, all of which is possible. I mean, this is not the Sudan, which is a horrific situation, but in which you cannot put your finger on a single, maybe some parties in the Gulf who could actually change that situation overnight. Here we know exactly what would end this. We know exactly who could end this with one phone call, with one demand. And that's not happening.
Yes, and I think what I agree completely, and I think what you've raised there leads us into two different facets of the world's response, and really analyzing and thinking about the condition that you've just mentioned, I think is, of course, leading to a transformation of politics. We can talk about that in a minute, but I did want to come back to two different facets or components of this kind of world response and critical analysis of it, because as you said, it has galvanized, seeing, the unhinged, attack upon Iran, potentially widening the theater of war to an uncontrollable regional, and escalating to the level of nuclear war, and all of the consequences that we've just been talking about in terms of reshaping kind of geopolitical security kinds of concerns, but also the continuation, the unresponsiveness of Western leaders, of any leaders really, to intervention on behalf of the people of Gaza, besides, the Ansar Allah in Yemen in the last few months. It has led to some new projects of protest, because the simple demonstrations weren't working and weren't effective. And so we did see some interesting attempts, a peace march to Rafah that was planned with a call for thousands of people to come together and to march through the Sinai from, to go to Cairo, and then get transport to a point at which they could then march and camp across the desert to break the siege of Gaza, to get to Rafah. We saw
Gaza.
Also the Freedom Flotilla more than once. Right now, at the time of recording, the second attempt by a ship associated with the Freedom Flotilla, the Handala, was boarded in international waters, and the people aboard were violently taken into custody in Israel.
Illegally taken.
Illegally, yeah, it's in international waters, so they've been
an act of piracy in international waters.
And so what we've been seeing is that different kinds of attempts, to mobilize people politically to break the siege of Gaza in the context of the starvation, the genocide reaching such incredible and long-lasting levels, and also, for example, the increasing effectiveness that we witnessed with an organization, Palestine Action, in the UK, that was proscribed because it was being effective in disrupting Elbit systems and associated financial and support institutions and companies for Israeli weapons manufacturing that were taking place in the UK. And so Palestine Action, as a direct action group, has preceded the Gaza genocide. They've been, working even in the couple of years before that. But during the genocide in particular, they were on the front line of, a kind of effective mobilization that was starting to expand as distress and outrage at what was happening in Gaza has only increased. So
but also individuals like Francesca Albanese, who I think, as recognition of her effectiveness in calling upon corporations to be reminded that they will be held accountable under international law, has now been officially sanctioned by the U.S. government, I think, in recognition of her efficacy. So we have to see the pushback. I had friends in England who were arrested in the protests to protest they're now been declared a terrorist organization, of these protest groups, of these solidarity groups, human rights groups in there, and there are less well-known efforts that have been successful at the legal level in Canada in making sure that organizations that mask themselves, that pretend to be charities, which are in effect supplying, building illegal settlements on the West Bank, are now no longer able to hide behind charity status. So there are other ways in which there are other effective means of protest that are going on across the board, both at the legal level, but also in the streets. The question is, I think, in terms of civil disobedience, what more can be done? And, the type of coalitions that the people who are missing in action and all of this, the whole swath of liberal North America that is not doing anything, is either just wringing their hands, whatever ethnic or religious background they have. Unlike the black churches, who have for a long time publicly called in the United States for a ceasefire. We haven't seen yet that kind of mobilization across, perhaps more so from the Vatican, but not across Catholic churches, who should be, orchestrating and echoing at least the Vatican positions on all of this within local dioceses. We haven't seen this across the board with Reform Judaism, which is just, as Peter Baynard said in a podcast today, don't our rabbis believe in God anymore? Reform, which is modern Judaism, which is not even recognized in Israel, doesn't even have the benefits of the Israeli state, but yet supports them so unconditionally, it is willing to forsake Jewish values, Jewish belief in justice, to pretend that genocide is justice. We have these Orwellian concepts that are still out there that we need to challenge at every level of civil society, religious communities. Genocide is not justice. It cannot be just. I mean, that's the equivalence. That's the equivalence that Israel and the case Israel's been making, and its defenders. That genocide is a form of justice for one day a one day attack on civilians, and that these kind of things. So I think on the one hand we see this uprising and these proliferation of demonstrations is unprecedented. I mean, there are actually groups who have gathered data and mapped out these demonstrations since October 7th, and they're just unprecedented worldwide. And they span the entire globe, from Japan, from the Pacific, to Ireland, from South America, Chile, where there's a large Palestinian expatriate and diaspora communities, all the way to Iceland, right? So the question is, yes, there's mobilization, but how can that be either coordinated better, brought into some kind of global surge that can really put pressure on politicians and change these policies. One thing to note also, in England, they've shifted from the Israeli embassy to the Egyptian embassy. So there are more and more protests against neighboring states that could actually make a difference in this, just like the Rafah March, which Sisi, the government of Egypt, basically ported and arrested and strong-armed most of the protesters who tried to make it to the Rafah Gate.
Well, exactly. They were suppressed by the current Egyptian government before it could even really get going. But that is, in fact, actually the question about what more can happen that would be effective, how that mobilization can crystallize into effective political pressure to change the policies of the West in particular, but also, of course, across the region. But, I mean, this is the thing, is there have been unprecedented numbers. Well, there were also unprecedented numbers during the Black Lives Matter, protests. Nobody had ever seen anything quite like that, happening in terms of the number of participants. But it just reminds me that during the Gulf War, for example, the Iraq War, there was a piece in the New York Times that hailed, the sort of peoples of the world as the new superpower because there have been so many incredible protests, 2 million in London, 1.5 million in Madrid, New York, like 1 million people, and so on. And of course, the Iraq War happened, and it wasn't prevented and continued for, a number of years. And so, I guess the point here is that there's been mobilization. The people are outraged. This is clearly the 7 billion people of the world or more are absolutely outraged and disgusted by what's happening. But there hasn't been some way in which this has achieved genuine politics, although that kind of resistance has elicited a response because it is seen as dangerous. It has had Palestine action proscribed. It has caused, a response to try and shut down the encampments that we saw at the universities, and to put in place all kinds of policies to prevent and isolate and
The
squash,
court,
political
the court.
protests and so on. So, yeah, and the courts, and so so we're seeing that. But I guess that's a big question. We don't know where it's headed. What could be more effective? But the question of other governments that should be more sympathetic, that have interests that are connected with in the region, whose populations are very outraged at what's happening, like the Egyptian government, like the Jordanians, like the Gulf, some of the Gulf, anyway. But the question here I would raise is, what about at the state level, any geopolitical kind of developments? We saw the Hague Group meeting that took place in Bogota. This group had been formed originally in January. 30 it expanded and invited a number of others, to 30 nations, to actually come to this conference in
July.
Bogota.
Yeah.
Gustavo Petro was the kind of key figure in helping
Yeah.
bring it together and organize, and he had some amazing kind of statements to make about solidarity, and his government is in fact actually doing things. But only 12 of these 30 countries signed up to provisions, and we could list them, but the basic provisions that they would sanction Israel. They wouldn't participate in arms sales and transport of arms and so on. But it was quite disappointing in a way to see that despite a lot of this rhetoric and a sense of the absolute emergency that's taking place right now, that only 12 nations, and they were, of course, the weaker third world countries, who have the most to lose, are the most vulnerable, or South Africa, that has already distinguished itself by taking a public stance and bringing the court case to the International Court of Justice. But the regional states, like Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, the Gulf states, even Malaysia, that has made other kinds of positive remarks and stopped some transport of weapons through its ports and so on. But China was attending, and it
Yeah.
also, of course, didn't do anything. And if you see, there was a recent report, Al Jazeera noted which countries have the largest volume of trade, import and export with Israel, and of course it is China, because it does business around the world. It's become the leading partner in trade for so many countries around the
Yeah,
world. But
and
Israel is no
Turkey
different.
has too not ceased its,
Yeah,
its economic relations.
yeah, that's also
Very
one of the
deep ties,
countries that's
very deep
listed. Yeah.
ties. So
So what do you think? How do you analyze like what's
well,
happening
I
in this
think,
sort of
well,
geopolitical
I mean, I
scenario?
think that's why I wanted to raise this famous quote of Gramsci, because I do think, it's not Gaza is the world, Gaza is the pivot to the future. What's going to happen, what's not going to happen, the accountability. Will structures hold? Can we believe in international law? Is there a way to create multilateral institutions out beyond the UN, that have any real teeth and can do anything? So I just want to recall that, because everybody's citing it, but I think we should look at it and maybe consider it in light of the way you and I discuss the past. I mean, I really don't think we can project the past into the future. I think we're into an uncharted territory. This is a future that we cannot imagine, the contours of which, the magnitude of which, the scale of which, has no precedent in previous history. But whatever it is, Gaza is in the center of it. And Gaza tells us that this is going on. So just going to go back to that famous quote of Gramsci from his third of his prison notebooks, the third volume of his prison notebooks. And it's listed under passato presente, past and present. He's looking at the past and trying to figure out what's going on. It's 1929. These are all written in his cramped handwriting while he's in prison. And it concludes with this statement that everybody quotes in English. La crisi consiste appunto nel fatto che il vecchio muore e il nuovo non può nascere. The crisis consists exactly of the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In questo interregno si verificano I fenomeni morbosi più svariati. And this is often translated, in this interregnum, we see the occurrence of monsters, but it's not monsters. It's actually morbid phenomena. And I think we can take that in several ways. These morbid phenomena are these ghoulish institutions that we have inherited, that have, in addition to being backed by power, they have enormous amount of vested individuals, who are linked in these systems and who will not let them go and will not let them change. But it's also morbosi in the sense that they're pathologies, that there are pathological ideologies in circulation, that nationalism in many ways has become gangrenous. It was a Faustian bargain at best, where some people would get full rights and the rest of the people inside and outside would get no rights, right? So I think it's this moment in understanding, what are these structures that are crumbling, and how far should they be? I don't want to be an Elon Musk, dismantle everything, but how far can we rebuild on the basis of the structures that we've inherited for a real future? How can these social institutions, still the social institutions, I've attended parallel conferences, 2005, 2015, for the environmental, the climate summits in Paris. And we're still talking to those multilateral institutions as if those multilateral institutions, which have consistently failed us, are going to do something to change what's going on. So on the one hand, I think part of it is to recognize the fatal historical flaws of those institutions and the limits that they impose upon themselves and upon change. And the other part, and I talk to friends who are liberals, trying to get them to realize that they have an illusory sense that there can be some repair for them, and that we can somehow put a patch on them, or that the Soroses of the world, the liberal capitalists who donate selectively here and there, can somehow atone for or or make right the kind of massive plunder that they've engaged in, in large parts of the world in order to accumulate that wealth that they now justify by setting up foundations and, advocating for civil society and NGOs, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that morbosi is, the pathologies are also these illusions that somehow we have to clear away in order to recognize that Gaza is ongoing. Gaza is not ending. We have not created a world in which Gazas will not happen again. They will happen again. Gaza is proof that it will happen again unless we address it. And of course, the people of Gaza, half of whom are children, are going to be living with the effects of these months, almost 2 years of siege, deprivation, we talk about mass starvation, we talk about deprivation of this and that. We're talking about collective torture, a regime of collective torture in which parents are forced to witness their children dying, are forced to fight with other parents to retrieve a morsel of food, who are going to live with children who are maimed and will suffer um, injuries and the results of malnutrition, undernutrition into adulthood that cannot be recovered. Um, and so this Gaza, which is our present and our future, is also must be a clarifying moment. This is my
Yeah,
feeling. That's my
that's right.
interpretation of what Gramsci's talking about, and how, if in any way, it's not forecasting fascism as such. It's that there's this moment of illusions that also has to be cleared away.
Well, I mean, that is, I think, really the central question politically that has to be really thought through. And I think you've put it very, very well that, there is no post Gaza. I mean, we're in like whatever the world that is being created as a consequence of what's happening in Gaza and how it is transforming pretty much everything and all these different possibilities. But what certainly concerns and worries me are those morbid kinds of phenomenon before some new world is born. We're in this transition, and it's like what a lot of people were talking about with the emerging rise of multipolarity and the decline of US or Western imperial hegemony. I mean, it didn't seem to me that it was an unalloyed kind of positive development. It's a necessary and positive development in the sense that you cannot build a new world order based on other kinds of principles and possibilities without, of course, those things happening, but that the kind of process of rebalancing and multipolarity in the world itself could be very dangerous, very destructive, have a lot of challenges. And I think we're kind of seeing, even with the acceleration that's taking place with Gaza, is that it is also creating the possibility for these neo-fascist or some kind of right-wing phenomenon, because they seem to be grasping even earlier and more clearly the bankruptcy of the kind of world that had been created and its institutions of international law and the financial institutions. That's all those things they are kind of rejecting, and the kind of politics surrounding it, they are rejecting for viciousness, for brutality, for kind of a reassertion of this nationalistic, exclusivistic, fascistic, racist kind of politics. And the left, the real question is can other popular forces congeal effectively to build these alternative, even imagine in an effective way any of these alternatives, possibilities for a world based on environmental sustainability, justice, equality, and so on. So I think you actually have absolutely put your finger on the moment that we're in and the place of Gaza in this. We titled the last episode Gaza is the world's futures, but I think what you're suggesting is that we're in the process of that future working itself out, globally at so many different levels.
And
And
Gaza is
yeah,
a generation. So it's not just the generation of the Gazans
no,
or the Palestinians. It is an entire global generation that was out on the streets, but and is going to be shaped by this, shaped politically by this into the future. Um, and it's that generation of youth who are, in effect, the world's global south, because the majority of the world's populations are young,
mm-hmm,
and they are going to be inherited this post-Gaza world, or this continuing Gaza world. They are going to be living in it, and they see it for what it is. While the wealthy, see Gaza as the failure, perhaps, of a horrific gated community,
right.
that, their security things break down, and
They
oh my
feel
God,
vulnerable and
the
anxious.
barbarians
That's
have
right.
broken out,
That's right.
and that they've crossed the Mediterranean. But I think it's also, it's this clarifying moment. I mean, look at how many global institutions have failed us, and that's one of the other things I want to say,
Oh,
which
we
is
could be here all day
no, no, no,
enumerating
no,
them.
the big ones:
Yeah,
international law,
yeah.
multilateral institutions, liberal capitalism, the sort of neoliberal promise of globalization, all the institutions of information and higher learning. We've got to think through all of these things at once. The universities have failed us, and they're failing us. And the fact that, so much of it was stockpiled in the United States, in major universities in the United States, shows you how vulnerable they are to being dismantled, and taking down with it a lot of the world's intellectual resources are going to go down with that, and they're not going to be reconstructed in the short term, whether it's global health research, or scientific or historical or anything else. um, it's a major blow, not just to the United States, to the world's. I mean, the first Trump administration, I don't know whether you remember, but when the data, scientific data, the environmental data was threatened, there was an underground railroad of data flowing to Canada, and people were just storing it up. God knows what's happening now. With the major silos of information being ransacked by the Trump administration, but they're not the U.S. They're the world's, any more than the British Library is British. It's the plunder of the world that's in there.
Well, that these are the contributions
Yeah,
of culture, of human culture,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
To this the common store of knowledge. These resources are precious ones. This is, I think, what's so dangerous about this moment, and I felt this for,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, a couple of decades since the global war on terror and the George W. Bush, Iraq War invasion. That this is a group and an elite that is willing, in the sort of mad scramble to either hold on to what they have or to exploit what
What
opportunity they might
remains?
have, that's going to be ending soon, that they are ready to destroy everything and everybody,
Mm-hmm.
in the process. I mean, it is such, that use of the word morbid, I think, is so
Mm-hmm.
correct, in some sense, because what it is this kind of like civilizational death wish. If we can't
Mm-hmm.
have Western supremacy, white supremacy, and Western hegemony, and a certain kind of, elite corporate capitalism, we will just like let the
Tear it all
world
down.
burn.
Yeah,
And maybe a few of us will escape, to Mars, or whatever, these Muskian techno futures,
yeah,
like the film Elysium, where the global elite kind of rules in this kind of paradisal techno future outside of the Earth, whose habitat has been destroyed
yeah.
and whose people are immiserated. And so I think that's what Gaza is really all about, is like, is that going to be the only future and the only possibility? And you're absolutely right that this generation is marked by this horrific, tragic historical experience. I mean, it's changing the world, their outlook, their understanding, and the world that they are inheriting is really very different. Um, I just don't even have any time. I'm sure you've been, it sounds like, still frustrated talking with some of these, liberals who just don't get it and think that you could repair this. It's just, we need a restoration. Got to get rid of the bad guys, Trump and Netanyahu. If it wasn't Netanyahu and if it wasn't Trump, we could, somehow have a world that made sense. And I think many and most people, understand and feel, or I think even just feel, that that isn't the case. Like something much more,
They don't see how
important has been broken.
sclerotic the institutions are,
Yeah,
and
yeah, I was thinking
and
necrotic. It's
yeah,
like Nancy Pelosi, all these like octogenarians who are still ruling the world.
yeah.
I mean, uh, and so it is also a generational war. It's a class and
No,
generational war.
absolutely, it's a generational war, and
Yeah.
generation has become class. It is a war of
Yes.
youth, of
And what that
the
means is that
global
they have,
South, and which is youthful, you
which,
know.
what it means is that if the generational war is a class war, it means that they, that generation has colonized the future,
Mhm.
essentially. Like,
Yeah,
basically we have to decolonize the future. Otherwise there's no real future.
absolutely. And the war on Gaza is a war on children and has been that way since the very beginning. So,
Yeah.
and
Well,
that's,
I
yeah,
mean, we're ending here on a somber
yeah,
note. I mean, basically everything that's happened since over the course of the 8 months since we recorded episode 7, Gaza is the world's future, is contributing to a feeling that indeed the stakes are global, world historical at the moment that we're in. And although we weren't able to come up with, some sense of exactly what some of the pathways for resistance may be for people who are listeners and watchers of the show and of the series, um, I think what we are really saying is that we have to really understand this past because, as you were saying, Ariel, the future is actually going to be very different. Something very different is coming.
must be,
Uh,
must
yeah,
be.
must be. Yeah,
Must
must be.
be.
And so we
And
will have to kind of,
we shouldn't fear that as such.
yeah,
We shouldn't fear
yeah,
that aspect of change, and we really have to dissipate these lingering illusions that we
yes.
have about repair. And
And also, I think, that there has been some sense of pessimism and despair. And why wouldn't you? Seeing what's happening, that has led some people I've seen, in political discourse, a desire, expressed in a way for revenge, vengeance, like, well, if this happens to, them, I won't shed a tear. Look what they did to Gaza, etc. Or this kind of feeling of brokenness, of like the actual possibilities of politics, of democratic politics being reaching these limits, and it producing other morbid kinds of responses and reactions that, of course, we understand why they would. Just reminds me a little bit of, like, for example, what Malcolm X said when he was, talking about, race politics in the 1960s, the ballot or the bullet, I mean, he was saying there's pressure that's building. And if there isn't a way in which this can be resolved, you know, um, through the system, there is going to be, an explosive kind of set of forces that will react. And I feel like we're so close to this in some sense. Like, there are lots of possibilities for change. The question is how to channel these in ways that will move beyond those kinds of destructive responses to something productive for that future world that we have to insist on is still a possibility, as a hopeful possibility for a better future and a better world. And one component of that is thinking about accountability. So that's another thing I've been seeing, is that there's been a lot of mobilizing around the future world when you will be able to, we will continue to strive to hold these corrupt leaders who have perpetuated the war criminals who are complicit in the perpetuation of the genocide in Gaza to account. And there are, attempts to document, there's the Accountability Archive, for example, that I know Phil Proudfoot and a couple others have put together, asking people to send in, documentation whenever they see it, of leaders, yeah, who have been shown complicity, with the Gaza genocide. So that's the kind of thing that I think, can be productive, is that, we have to imagine that this is going to be history in some future. And we should be, guerrilla historians, if I can, say that, related to the podcast that I'm co-host of, in terms of mobilizing and documenting, because we do want to have the social movements and the political capacity to hold these people accountable and make it known to them now that there will be accountability, because that's one of the possible options for putting political pressure on them to break this absolute unanimity of the Western elites' complicity in support of the genocide. Absolutely. That is so important. Both sides, we need to be documenting the war criminals and we need to be documenting the resistance, because these are resources for accountability on the one hand, and, as you're saying, learning and improving our movements, on the other. Really, it does seem like this is a question of what is the human? Will there be human dignity in the future? That's what we have to be committed to. Um, I think this has been a very kind of interesting and important conversation. I want to thank you, Ariel, for sharing your thoughts and analyses, not only throughout the whole series, but also today, in terms of thinking about what's been happening the last 8 months and where we are poised at this moment at the emergency where Gaza is being starved. And this is a call really for action in various ways. I think also that maybe listeners of the whole series and this episode will have a lot of questions and thoughts. So I want to promise that there will be an opportunity in the near future, maybe to collect some of those thoughts and to have you, if you're willing, Ariel, come back on and talk with me about them and respond to listeners. And because everybody is really grappling, with trying to make sense of this and also how to respond and what to do about it. And I think that kind of guidance and analysis will be useful. So I want to encourage listeners to this episode and to the series to be on the lookout for, send me your questions on social media. And if you can support this project. You can go to patreon.com/Adnan Hussein. Make sure that this is free and available for everybody. There are costs associated with producing this and hosting it on the platform. We want to make sure as many people. So if you can, first, give money to Gaza. If you can also support this series to make sure that the political education, the history, and the call to action get out to as many people as possible on these various different channels. Until next time,